Well, I know the last session ran over, so I'm sure we'll have additional people coming in. But since we only have an hour for this, I thought we'd get going so that we can have a good discussion and not have to cut things short. Thank you for coming. This is the session on transforming the power sector in South and Southeast Asia, which is the regional focus of this year's forum. And I can't think of a more important region to focus on in terms of power sector issues. And I'm Bob Eichhorn. I'm senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, formerly with State and AID. And I somehow over the last 2 years I did these papers, and so I hope you take them so they don't have to lug them back to Washington. And appreciate any comments that people want to send me. So we have a very distinguished and diverse panel here to talk about the regions and the power sector transition issues and fuel issues. And I'll start by introducing everyone, and then we'll go to questions, and I'll say a few introductory remarks in terms of context, and then we can I'll ask each question to sort of kick off discussions. But I want to involve the audience, especially since we're relatively small right now, and so it will be I think be great to not only just ask questions and responses, but actually try to get some discussion going on some of the key issues. I mean, clearly these regions major challenges and as well as strategic importance. So first, Samantha Carl-Yoder, Director, International Affairs and Marketing at Tellurian, who we all know is one of our growing LNG exporters. And we're colleagues from State, and she, a long time ago, was in the Foreign Service in Indonesia, so, which was my first love because I did my PhD in Indonesia. Okay, so Aman Ghalib, CEO of DABS, which is the National Electric Utility of Afghanistan, formerly with the ministry as deputy minister. And thank you. He was all over the place over the last couple of days with Irina and the different places. So thank you. I'm glad you made it, Aman. Kartikeya Singh is the deputy program director of the SED Fund in the Netherlands. And he has just left, unfortunately for us in Washington, because he was managing the India program and dealing with energy in the different states of India, and was just doing a tremendous job at CSIS. So thank you for coming. I hope your new position is working out well. And Thomas Spencer is our fellow from the Terry, which I go way back in my work with AID and working with Terry and all the good work that they've done in energy and resources in India. Terry was very active in the Sustainable Energy for All program that I was working with when I was at State Department. So before I ask each a question, I will say some introductory remarks to get my 2 cents in here. And make four major points. Some of them really take off from what Fatih was saying this morning, which I thought was very interesting from my perspective, working on the power sector issues and the decarbonization issues, particularly in this region. But I always start my talks by saying, 80 to 90% of future energy and electricity growth is going to be in the non-OECD developing countries. And just think about that, It's enormous implications geopolitically in the global markets, et cetera. And now already developing countries account for 60% of global electricity generation. So if they're going to double, or more than double over the next 20 years, it's going to go up to like 75% of global electricity in these markets. And of course, South and Southeast Asia is one of the most growing markets with over 5% a year generation historically. Whether they'll continue that level of demand growth is a big question and a very important question for the future for many reasons. Fatih talked about electrification, and clearly electrification in this region and other regions is growing rapidly, not only because you're expanding access, but you've got urbanization, you've got population growth, and you've got the two regions together, you know, the population is going to go up to about 3 billion people by 2040. Over 500 million over the 2 decades. Tremendous, and so at least a third, right, of world population in these two regions. And sort of unlike some of the other regions, Asia is becoming more and more import dependent. On the Middle East, you know, potentially on U.S. and North American supplies, and part of that is because, and so countries have turned to gas, coal imports, as well as the traditional oil imports, and that's had tremendous pressure on the budgets and the economies of the countries. And in some cases, like in Pakistan, Bangladesh, the two countries that I focused on in these papers, domestic gas production, which really was pretty adequate for a long time, has not kept up with demand. And so they're having import gas, and with the, and Samantha will talk more about this, and with the advent of FSRUs, you've got really a lot of countries now beginning to develop that. And then finally, last but not least, the environmental and climate change issues, I think, are driving more and more policy decisions and efforts with countries, not only with the Paris and the NDC process, but just because pollution, and you know, recently another smog alert in Delhi and the cities, and you know, I first went to Asia and to the Philippines and Southeast Asia in 1970, and there, I mean, it was, you know, compare it now to these cities that have been so clogged and so congested. And that's only going to get worse with the urbanization. And like in South Asia, you're less than 50% urban. It's just beginning in these respects in terms of that reach. Southeast Asia, of course, is more significant. So huge demand, huge investment requirements to meet that energy demand. And the issue is, how do you develop a sustainable energy system that's not going to wreck the globe and the countries in terms of their environments? And I think, I mean, you've got to look at broader resources. You've got to look at energy, water nexus, all these kinds of issues as we look at this. So, in a sense, lots of things to pursue. So we'll start, Samantha, with you in terms of trying to give us a picture of how Tellurian is trying to begin to market LNG in this dynamically growing region, sees the market. What are the obstacles that you're facing, the financial position of the countries as they look at buying this? How are you navigating this, all these issues?
So I have an hour for...
Yeah, well, a few minutes.
We'll start off with sort of the meta level. And I think it's well known that the LNG market over the past couple of years has changed tremendously. You've seen a significant increase in supply of natural gas production, which means, of course, the supply of LNG from Australia, from the United States. And what that increased supply has been doing is put downward pressure on price, which makes LNG a bit more attainable for some of the countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia. What you've also seen, and Bob has touched on this, is with the advent of the FSRU, the expansion of the use of FSRUs and the decreasing costs of their daily usage, countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, have been able to utilize them in a way to allow for cheaper imports of LNG to make up for their declining domestic production. And you have countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, others in Southeast Asia that are looking to adopt additional FSRUs to allow them to import LNG as they start thinking about how they want to expand and change their energy matrix. And so if you're looking at LNG to power, the fact that you have FSRUs, the fact that you have lower LNG prices means that it's an option where, 10 years ago, maybe it wasn't an option. And I think, what we're seeing a lot of is countries you talk about what, as they're looking at their climate demands, they're looking at environmental issues, they're looking at health issues. Governments are really saying, what can I be doing to improve electrification? How can I change the energy mix and at the same time still make it so that I am not breathing in particulate matter every time we walk outside? And so you're seeing a shift in some places faster than others of using more natural gas, whether it be piped gas, domestic production gas, or LNG for power. And so from a Tellurian perspective, as an exporter of United States natural gas, we see LNG prices decreasing, and we see that the market is really ripe and that the demand for LNG is going to continue to expand far faster than the supply.
Fatih had, his chart showed that estimated LNG demand in India and Southeast Asia at 250 BCM by 2040. Does that sound in the ballpark?
Sounds in the ballpark.
Okay.
Might even be low. And then you add in the China demand, you add in the Southeast Asia demand.
Yeah.
It's tremendous.
Well, we'll get to the India demand question later on. Okay, now Aman, the issue of utilities and how this environment is changing the utility business, but yet you still are faced with the basic issues of how do you create viable utilities in countries. And it's a relevant question, I think, in both regions. I mean, Indonesia, PLN has its problems as well as, in Pakistan and Bangladesh, but you're in a particularly challenging environment in terms of achieving that kind of role for the utility. Well, how do you see your main challenges and experience in tackling that?
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. In Afghanistan, of course, what we have a challenge as a utility is a bit unique in a sense that we are importing more than 80% of our power from 4 neighboring countries, from Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. And the second challenge, which of course more dependency, and all these import powers contracts which we have they have all unique and different because their systems are not synchronized with our systems technically. So that's why we have to run each of the power importing into an island system. And for island system, having a separate, we are working in IEC standards. All these 3 countries in Central Asia work on the GOST standard. That makes a challenge as well by itself. So, and then the tariffs structures are different. And so one is the barriers which we have seen that utilities, as utility in Afghanistan, that managing these all 4 different countries' power separately, independently, not synchronize them, makes as a utility difficult for works. The second, the trains in Afghanistan is a bit different. We are too mountainous, too many off-grid locations, and plus the way the regulatory structure in the country, because of the being in civil war, because in being in the different kind of geopolitical issues. Collection and the utility we have seen as one of the collection of revenues has been a major challenge in a state like in Afghanistan, because people are not used to the past of paying monies to utility. Now, if this people not had access to power, but now they're getting access to power, so they're not used to paying the money. But at the other end, we as utility have to pay these import countries which are importing the money in advance because of not having the trust the import countries, our neighbor countries, having in the in Afghanistan utility sector, that they're afraid that due to the political situation, due to the different wars which are happening, or due to different factions are there, they're afraid that we will not be able to pay them their monthly bills. That's what they take the money in advance, and they're putting really harsh penalties and different kind of import barriers. At the other end, the people who is not economically not good in the economical, situation is not good, and they're not willing to pay the tariff. So the challenge is that how do we make the tariffs to become more affordable, at the same time we make it the utility to be more profitable as well. So that's why when we try to look into social issues or look at the political issues or look into the business aspects of the utility, that's where, of course, we comes. But touch wood, I mean, despite all of these challenges, despite we have some issues on collections, two types of collection challenges in the countries. I've seen it, I've studied because I've been member of SARC, Energy Center board member, and from ECO as well. All these regional, including the Central Asia and South Asias, the collection of debts from the past, which has been a tremendous issue. So we have collections issues from the government buildings, who of course sees utility because utility like DAPS is a government utility. So Ministry of Finance paid them to pay us, and of course at the same time, Ministry of Finance of course owns the utility. So they're not really willing to pay what exactly, if the Ministry of Finance, the government budget is low, they're not paying. So we have to get challenged. And the second, and is of course, is the people, of course. If the economy goes down, if the situation goes ups and down, people not afford to pay the electricity bills on time because of war we have it, because of fictions we have in different areas, because of more than 30% losses we have it, because when we importing power from neighboring countries, almost 50% of the areas who is not in the control of the government. So those areas we cannot cut the power, because if we cut the power, we get all these different issues of they cut the power to the urban areas in Kabul, in the capital. But if we give them power, they're not paying the money. So in this situation of affordability, social issues of the governments, and plus trying to reduce the losses, which is, so in the collecting for the debts from the government and from that, is a big challenge, but DAPS has been financially at the level, of course, we've never been financially, two losses. I mean that we have been not profitable utility, but not been, we haven't ended up in circular debt, or we not end up in any not paying it. From the last 12 years, we keep paying our neighbors, but keeping it that at this stage like this, if you want to make it sustainability the way you say that has to be made sustainable, will be a bit challenge, but it's not impossible if there is a proper regulatory, proper policies, and proper assistance. I'll say if available, I'm sure then we can bring in right systems.
And despite the difficulties, have you been able to expand the access in the last couple of years?
Since we have 1.6 million customers, which covers almost 40% of the Afghan populations from the grid. We're running the system in 7 island systems in different ways, but we have 8 provinces which we don't have access to the national grid, providing with these generators. But the expansion of the customers in the last 4 years, or the 5 years in this current government came in, tremendously increased a lot. We have had from 1.2 million to reach to 1.6 million. So it's almost 500,000 customers. We have expansions, and the reason behind that was that we have managed to expand the national grid more to the main center of every provinces. So we've been successful on that one. So
good. Well, we'll come back to the issue of renewable decentralized in a minute. I'm going to skip, Thomas, I'm going to skip to Kartikeya and let him talk about India in particular, where we've, for many years, we've dealt with the issues of losses and distribution, financial viability problems. But I wanted to ask you about sort of the progress on the renewable energy development and Modi's 175 gigawatt target by 2022, which is, when it was first announced, I remember, we all said, well, that's a pretty ambitious target, but a lot has happened, and a lot of major investments have been made by both Indian and foreign investors. So how does it look now, and what do you think are the main sort of bottlenecks that need to be addressed if they're going to really ramp up further and meet these targets?
Yeah, and I think the new question that people are probably soon going to be asking is, the 450 gigawatt target that was announced
One at a time.
Yeah, exactly. So you're right. The 175 gigawatt was incredibly ambitious, and I always like to say that the Modi administration, in particular, employs a tactic that I like to call shoot for the moon, hit the ceiling. You basically send a very strong market signal, reach for the stars, and hope you'll make it. You may or may not. And there are, of course, a lot of questions about the viability of ratcheting up the solar target in particular by 4 times what the previous administration had announced. But the figures that are coming out, and I think they're just a couple days old from the ministry, are that everything installed and currently under tendering puts India at 150 gigawatts. So in 2 years' time, 25 gigawatts does not seem out of reach for them to accomplish. And I think they've taken that into account, as well as additional power generating capacity, installed capacity factors in wind and solar that could probably help them achieve 450 gigawatts, even if land and other issues are resolvable. Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to India and looking at these national level targets, it's important to understand, and I think this is kind of my previous background that you were alluding to, Indian states become quite important. We're not talking about engaging India here. We're talking about engagement with India's states. And the reason that is, and this goes when you're just doing business with India, you're not, again, engaging with India, but you're choosing which state, essentially which country in India to deal with. Because the way the Indian constitution is designed, it gives tremendous power under a concurrent list over factors that impact people's everyday lives. And that includes things that are very close and important to business, everything from labor and land to manufacturing. The power sector falls squarely in this category. So, and what makes state governments so authoritative and powerful in their decision-making and how they procure technologies, design budgets, is that it's a unicameral system at the state level. And when the elections happen and the majority of seats, when they're won by a party, they choose a chief minister. And that person basically gets to be able to have considerable decision-making power over budgets and policies and tariffs. So when we look at the renewables target from a state-by-state basis, that's really the way to kind of assess the health of this 175 gigawatt target. And a state like Karnataka already exceeded its portion of that 175 gigawatt target, what was allocated to it to meet that national level target. The neighboring state, which was doing quite well, Andhra Pradesh, had a election change. A totally new party came into power and started relooking at and examining existing power purchase agreements, which was incredibly detrimental to investor confidence in the sector quite broadly, and created, frankly, some conflict between the center and the state as to what they could actually do. And they've actually resolved that issue now, I've heard recently. So they're being compensated for what they see as higher charges in those power purchase agreements, but they haven't been able to basically cancel those contracts, which is a good thing. Again, going back to nearby Karnataka, there was a very interesting case probably about a year and a half ago where the state's electricity regulatory committee and the state's political arm were at loggerheads over deciding to reopen, again, power purchase agreement for wind contracts because neighboring Andhra Pradesh, they had better price discovery. And while the Electricity Regulatory Commission of the state wanted to reopen and lower the costs, the politicians had better sense and knew that doing so would harm investor confidence in the state more broadly. So nobody wants to be sort of seeing as going back and reneging on some of these contracts. So I think the watching what's happening at the state level is key, and that's what I have to say about the national level target.
And in the early days, obviously, you had a lot of investment in wind, and a lot of developers in Tamil Nadu and others were pursuing the wind project. It seems more recently you've had much more attention on the solar PV developments and the big mega auctions for those projects. And how much foreign money is coming in compared to domestic money?
So I don't have the figures of foreign versus domestic on that, but what I will say is that where India is in its sort of power sector transformation is that a lot of the sort of renewables focus has been thanks to private investment, both domestic and foreign, whereas investments into thermal power assets and development of those continues to be the state-owned banks, which I think that the tricky part now is really going to be dealing with the finances that have been kind of locked into these thermal power assets, which are now being outcompeted by renewables, right? And so if you're the head of a utility, you're going to want to know how you can get out of these long-term contracts from thermal power when you know you can get access to cheaper renewable. And we haven't even gotten to the point of repowering wind in India as we're having the conversation in the US. So most of the Class A sites for wind development in India were taken up a long time ago because India was one of the leading countries with installed wind capacity. But now as bigger mega-class turbines are available, there's the possibility to really ramp up and get more juice out of wind. So, and I think there's going to be considerable private sector investment interest in that front.
Okay, great. So in India, but also in other countries as well, I mean, in Pakistan, as Ambassador Olson knows that there was a major effort that the U.S. made with OPEC and others to develop wind systems in the Sindh, and now you have more solar development. But many countries, ASEAN has a renewable energy target, you know, as well of 23% by 2025, I think it is. Thomas, as you look at this issue of scaling up renewables in India and perhaps other countries, how do you see the challenge here of integrating into the systems? What is India doing in terms of the grid modernization and also in terms of dealing with backup power and the responsibilities for that?
Well, thanks very much for the invitation, and happy to be here. Very important discussion. So let me frame my marks with a couple of data points to start with. If you look at NTPC, the National Thermal Power Corporation, it's the most efficient thermal power company in India. The capacity-weighted tariff of its existing assets is 3.7 rupees per kilowatt hour. Okay? You have renewables bids coming in at between 2.5 and 3. The lowest ones, 2.5, I'm going to say it publicly, are too low. Developers, investors are not making a proper return on investment there. But definitely you can get it in between 2.75 and 3, no problem. About a third of the existing thermal power stations in India have a variable tariff, just marginal cost of above 2.5 rupees per kilowatt hour. So these are really at risk from any incremental power coming in from renewables. So my perspective is that in India, electricity demand growth is going to be largely met through renewables, but with a big caveat of how quickly can you scale up renewables when demand is growing rapidly. So for me, it's no longer an issue of the cost of renewables, but it is an issue of the institutional and economic challenges of grid integration. And they are serious, and they will create constraints of how rapidly you can scale up renewables. So let me give you a quick sense of the challenge, and then we can continue the discussion if there are any questions. If you look at jurisdictions which have high shares of renewables, they tend to share characteristics which I don't think you can apply to India. Say California, South Australia, Denmark, Germany. These characteristics include they have large installed capacities of relatively old, amortized, flexible supply-side options like gas or hydro, right? Or they are embedded in larger grids which are large relative to their own size so that they can shift excess power or bring in deficit power. So that's the case of Denmark, but even California imports about 15% of its power. Doesn't apply to India. They have high capacity factor renewable resources, offshore wind, for example. Doesn't apply to India, whose wind resource, while good, is not a particularly high capacity factor. You're looking at maybe 25%, maybe 30% in the best sites. Solar, of course, is maximum, maybe 21%. So again, there's a challenge there. And they have mature electricity markets where you have quite sophisticated real-time price signals for the kind of flexibility that you need to bring into the system. So the classic example is, you've got prices in ERCOT in Texas which go from negative to 10,000 US dollars per megawatt hour when there's a real need to suck in electricity because you're experiencing a deficit. In India, the power market is still very nascent. It covers only a very small share of generation, about 3 to 6% is covered by the power market, depending on how you define the power market. Whereas 90% is tied up in long-term contracts. And within the power market, you have price volatility, which is maybe 1 rupee per kilowatt hour from peak to trough on average. So again, it's not sending a strong signal, hey, we need flexibility. So the government is pretty aware of this. I can get into what they are doing to try and deal with these problems. But my overall message would be renewables are definitely the future in India, but it will not be easy to scale them up. And one of the main constraints will be how quickly can you bring in flexibility into the power system.
One question here to follow up is why haven't the gas plants been more utilized? Obviously, there have been tremendous problems with pricing and things like that. But I mean, there was as much as 10,000 megawatts of unused gas capacity and fairly modern plants that were not last I checked.
So there's a couple of issues here, and I think it's a really good way to get into the flexibility discussion because
Right.
I think, in my view, gas has to be part of the option. First issue is that the availability of domestic gas declined with production declining and a preferential allocation to other sectors where it was seen to be a higher social priority that they received cheaper domestic gas. So typically this is the domestic sector, it's the industrial sector, it's the fertilizer sector in particular, and power comes almost last. Second issue is the relatively high cost of imported gas. So plants running on imported gas will typically have a tariff that is above 6 rupees per kilowatt hour, and discoms are just not willing to pay that. So they prefer not to offtake that power. Then the third issue is that these plants would be great for providing flexibility, meeting peak load, and so on, but without a market for them to play in which values that flexibility, and with all the distortions in the market which decrease the value of flexibility. For example, discoms, if they're having trouble a couple of hours in the evening, they can shed load, and that's a big distortion on the value of any plants that are providing peak load, for example. So those, I would say, are the three big issues.
Very interesting. Of course, I mean, you remember Fatih's comments this morning about the fact that in a lot of countries that the gas import is being driven by non-power factors. And I don't know, Samantha, if you want to talk about that, but clearly it is being driven by power factors in other countries, and particularly, I think, if you look at a Vietnam or something like that in terms of how they're trying to not be totally reliant on coal in terms of moving ahead by importing gas and also developing renewables. You want to comment at all about India and the gas import?
No, I think that's right, and I think it's pretty well known, and I think a lot of people here would agree, that India is not going to be really using LNG for power. There might be a desire to, and maybe if there are some regulatory changes, if there are some price adjustments, but I think that our conversations with the Indians, they're really looking at it for transport sector, changing trucks over to LNG, the city gas distribution, so fertilizer. There are other sectors where LNG is really a more viable option, and if that's in fact the case, does it free up domestic production to then be utilized in the existing power plants that are underutilized? So that's a possibility. But I don't see LNG right now being turned into power. Not the current structures, it's just too price sensitive. But then you have countries like Vietnam where they are using a mixture of oil coal and domestic production. Their domestic gas production is declining. There is a concerted effort by the government to improve the environmental quality of the air for health reasons. And so that country is really looking at LNG to power. Now, Vietnam currently imports 0 LNG. It is something they're expecting, I think, within the next 5 years that LNG demand will be about 4 metric tons a year. But it's a plan. And so even though the government says they want to reduce coal, they're actually, I think, just commissioned 2 new coal-fired power plants. So it's a narrative that the question is whether implementation is actually going to happen. That being said, for Vietnam and its master plan, they are putting forward at least 2, if not 3, LNG to power plants that will have an associated either terminal or an FSRU, likely an FSRU, that will allow them to import LNG. But in a country like Vietnam, where LNG imports is brand new, they really need to have a better understanding of what the market looks like, what it could mean for the country overall, and are there other sectors where you could use LNG? And the way that the regulatory regime is currently structured, a company, if it is approved to import LNG, can only import LNG for what is approved in the master plan. Meaning if you put together a power plant and you have too much LNG, you can't resell it downstream. And so these are things that the companies are trying to struggle with the government to say, what is it that we can actually do? What makes sense? And so from a regulatory perspective, having some understanding of who can import, how can you import, can you resell later and optimize? These are all questions, I think, that need to come to fruition as they move towards LNG to power.
So Vietnam is another case then of where sort of domestic gas supplies are declining, and Thailand is another example.
Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia.
And how about Indonesia? I mean, many years ago I predicted that Indonesia would be a net oil importer, and a lot of people are predicting that it's going to be a net gas importer before too many years. How do you see that prospect? Because obviously it's, as the largest power system and energy user, it could have a big impact on the Asia market.
So I think Indonesia is a fascinating example because with an archipelago of 17,000 islands, you might have one area that will be producing natural gas, while you'll have another area that's importing, whether it's importing from domestic or whether it's importing international, just the way that the geography of the islands run. I do think that you're seeing a lot, and Pertamina is in the other room, but there are, studies that are showing that domestic production is declining. And so that if they are continuing to use natural gas for the various sectors in which they use it, they will need to start importing, and they are. And what you've seen in the past year is that, the Indonesian government has actually changed the way that imports can be done. They've taken some of that power away from Pertamina and given it to PGN. Which was a subsidiary, now will become a separate company, which is the National Gas Company. And so being able to, again, clearly define the rules of the game, so who do you talk to about imports, who has the authority for what, so they're not competing with each other, just increases the efficiencies.
Well, clearly the gas market issues are going to be critical. I mean, Australia, of course, has ramped up enormously, but I was reading where people were talking about that a lot of the contracts at higher levels are going to potentially run into problems as the spot market develops for LNG further, and where the companies had high cost development to begin with,
right,
and then had high cost long-term contracts.
That's right. And what you're seeing, of course, is the lower prices of LNG. The spot market prices are exceptionally low. I think if you're looking forward curve, you're going to have higher LNG prices over the next 15, 20 years, but spot prices are still going to continue to be extraordinarily competitive. I think in the past year and two, you've seen fewer long-term contracts being signed, SPAs being signed, because companies and countries are thinking that they can play in the spot market. There will be a point in time when contracts are going to be more utilized, but also if you want to have a guaranteed, secure, reliable source of natural gas, whether it be LNG or piped, you're going to want a contract. Because at a certain point in time for spot pricing, if you don't have the vessels available to actually ship it in, or you're competing with somebody else on pricing could go up. The spot market is useful, but it should not be your sole basis for sourcing your LNG if you're really looking at LNG to power.
So the coal-gas competition in the region. I don't know if anybody wants to try to tackle that. I mean, I of course look at it from, and in the papers I talk about obviously the major financing by China and Japan of coal-fired plants in the region, and some of the data that I was looking at in discussions suggest that the coal, the supercritical units power purchase agreements are being signed for as much as 8 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's not that cheap, and gas, if gas prices stay low, it is possible, I think, that in a lot of these environments that it would be that gas would be a cheaper option. So I think the issue of China's involvement is obviously a key issue for the power sector, given the Belt and Road Initiative and its heavy emphasis on power. I talk a little bit about that in the paper. Clearly, Pakistan has been a major focus of where China has been pursuing it. How about in India? China has been involved, at least in providing equipment to a lot of the coal power plants. Are they still, what can you say about their involvement in India?
Well, India has come out quite clearly saying it does not support the Belt and Road Initiative and will not accept investment from it. And actually, a lot of India's engagement in the region and in the regional power market, they're exporting to Bangladesh, they're importing from Bhutan, they're very keen on increasing links with their neighbours, is in part as a counterweight to the Belt and Road Initiative. So Chinese financing will not make a difference to the coal story in India. The real story in India, as Kartikeya rightly said, is that historically coal-fired power plants have been funded by the state-owned banks. Mm-hmm. Many of them have been severely burnt by the stranded assets that have built up in the power sector as a result of a large boom of investment that happened prior to and just after the global financial crisis, and then a drop-off in demand. So we're facing about 50 gigawatts of coal-fired plants that are formally stranded, as in their loans have been declared NPAs and are being followed up by the Reserve Bank of India. That's about 1 in 5 of power sector loans has been declared a non-performing asset. So the way I see it is India may need to build a few more coal plants. I don't actually think that many. I think renewables will come in, and when they're available will be the most competitive source. And then the question is, what is the most competitive source when they're not available? And a big new coal-fired power plant that is running at 40 to 50% load factor is not particularly competitive. Even imported gas, say at $8 per MBTU or 7.5, in a gas-fired power plant that is running at 45% load factor is competitive with coal. So I think the story will be, what meets that margin when renewables are not available. It may be a few extra coal plants, but I don't think too many, and I think it will be maybe a bit of extra natural gas, but certainly batteries will come in as well. So I'm not sure, given the financial history that we've faced now, that there will be much more investment in coal.
Interesting, yeah. So switching gears a little bit to bring Mr. Ghalib back in. We obviously see the development of decentralized renewable energy technologies throughout the world, and particularly in Asia. I've worked with Bangladesh, which obviously has a lot of solar systems for home systems, and now many microgrids, and et cetera. It would seem that Afghanistan would be a perfect place to do that. Is your utility involved, or are others trying to disseminate and commercialize the renewable technology?
With regards to, as I said, decentralized technologies is best in regions where the national grid cannot reach. I mean, where the national grid is available, of course, people will not really interested in decentralized because the quality-wise, but the cost-wise. Mm-hmm. Afghanistan, of course, like any other country in the region, is one of the I think that one of the most important solution is off-grid solutions, because for us as a utility, expanding the grid to really the mountains, to taking in the trains, and especially some of the really Hindu Kush areas, which is the ceiling of the world, is much expensive compared to the small decentralized with battery backups or any of these generators. So we have almost, with the decentralized system, with domestic sources, based on the last year report which the UN has done, Afghanistan has 98% access to electricity with, because of the solars. I mean, there's 98% of the people has access to power from these decentralized renewables and solar systems. National grid, of course, utility, we cover only 40% of it.
Okay.
So it means our Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development, they are mostly involved in the off-grid solutions based on our renewable energy policy, which we have developed. Up to 1 megawatt, they will be involved. Because we, as a utility, what we have noticed, I mean, below 1 megawatt is not really cost-effective for us to run that small independently. So we are involving now, getting back because of some challenges for collection of the system, which we have already developed. So due to new policy that anything above 400 kilowatt has been going to come back to us as utility, and we have established a renewable energy section. But we are doing it as outsourcing. We're giving it to private sectors to operate it for us instead of us ourselves get involved or to extend it. So in a sense, I mean, renewable energy, of course, is making a big difference. So that's what we have, 8 provinces, plus on top of it, we have more than 5,000 diesel generators operated by army and military bases, I mean, Ministry of Defense and Interiors. So the idea that we are connecting those bases, especially Ministry of Interiors, that have small checkposts at the top of the mountains for controllings. So we are going with this off-grid solutions. We've done economical feasibility, it's much more feasible. So that's what I think it really has an importance, will remain as it is. But something I just want to add, because of this topic of the conversation which we have today, that what we can do collectively in the region, what is, of course, each country, Afghanistan, India, of course, Bangladesh, Central Asian countries, they independently, everyone doing their best. But I believe from my perspective, that's what Afghanistan is trying to play the role of energy hub. If we try to connect the Central Asia with the South Asia, where we have the surplus of power and cheap power, for me, is it in private investment when it's coming in, like what we did in the gas. In Afghanistan, the government seen the gas project not to profit from the gas, national gas, which we have in existing, but important is the electricity. So the government has reduced the gas tariff to the private investors. We have, from Siemens here, we have it. We buy the mobile systems of them, the wellhead generators that we bought them to reduce the gas tariff to sell it to Siemens and the partner Bayat, so that we can have cheap electricity, so we can give it that. So the importance is that. So if we can work out the solutions in the long term, there will be no gas. Everyone knows that it will be some issues. Central Asian countries have surplus powers, mostly from the gas, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. So the idea is that if we could come work as integrated systems, as synchronized systems, as a transit or exchange of energy trade, if we concentrate more in the region, I think that will be the good future compared to concentrating on our own self-sufficiencies, our own businesses. I think the way Europe has developed, the way America, of course, doing the business energy trade, if we concentrate in the region on energy trade, and Afghanistan can play a big role as energy, as a land bridge, connecting the Central Asia with South Asia. So in the long term, if in case there are some issues in the gas in the Central Asian, the big, huge potentials of Bangladesh and Nepal and India can help back this in the long terms. And I think if we concentrate on that part of it, we can cover most of the issues. And if we concentrate more on these energy transit projects, the border areas which right now we're facing to electrify, if the power goes to them, then we can give them some power from the grid, from these ABB's new initiatives, that from the transmission lines up to 500 kilowatt, you can give them from the existing earthing lines, you can give them. So that will reduce the dependency on small mini grids as well. So.
Yeah, I wish we had time to cover more of the regional stuff, but I want to open up now and have a few minutes of questions, comments too, not just questions, because obviously there have been a lot of issues that we've discussed here, and if anybody has any strong feelings or statements that they want to make, please go ahead. Please. Right?
One actually talked about the Buy It project with Siemens. There's actually a presentation at 3:45 later by the Buy It group on the main stage. So I recommend everyone to go down and listen to how they did some creative financing for that project. Thank you all for coming and being part of this panel, and thank you, Bob, for hosting this. A question for the group. TAPI never goes away, and TAPI made the news again the other day as far as the pricing is concerned, and there was some pushback, obviously, from Pakistan, India, and others. I just want to get you the consensus. Is this still fantasy, or is this something that people really are putting into their energy mix? Because it's one of those things that just keeps coming and going, coming and going.
The TAPI? TAPI project is coming, that's for sure, but what we have done with TAPI project, because of the political challenges between the two, India and Pakistan issue, which is delaying it, Afghanistan, we're just working on TA now, Turkmen-Afghanistan's. So the Turkmenistan has almost the line, pipeline is coming to the border, and Afghanistan, which we have planned, we have done a study which ADB supported, how we can at least take the gas which is coming to the border, either take it to Herat or down. We believe that if we do that project, at least work on TA, then the Pakistan, of course, will comes in, and then we don't have to wait for all the 4 countries to collectively, one time we have to finish it. So in Afghanistan side, we are almost ready. We have finished all the lands. We have also finished the LARP issues, the social issues, security issues. We have given that. And because we cannot take the pipeline all the way to the border to Pakistan or to Quetta, but we have reached an agreement to bring it to the border of Afghanistan, the Turkmenistan, and we use our share at least, which we have in it. And idea which we are working with Siemens in phase 2 of the program, they have it. We have encouraged them and other participants, especially the EU. We have been, our ambassadors arranged last year event. We're encouraging the EU investors, they are more in gas, because Qatar and that, they were more interested to bring to Farah in those provinces. At least if we can bring to the border, then distributed way, we can produce either power from it or to the industries areas to give them the power. So I'm sure if we do that, some movement will be there, and of course the trust will be built up the way we did for CASA project, which is of course in the report has been printed as well, that Afghanistan has done tremendous job to removing his converter stations from Afghanistan, make it much easier for ABB or other Siemens or other big parties to come and participate in the project. So,
Okay, other questions, please.
So thank you very much to the panel. My name is Keramat Fakhari from Siemens Power Generation. So we are working closely with Mr. Ghalib and the DAPS team on the initiatives and the buyouts. So from Siemens, what we are seeing right now is more and more renewables coming to the grid, and we see a decline on the conventional power generation, gas turbines. How does the panel see that in future? Because the more we are progressing in terms of renewables, the more the grid becomes unstable, and the more we need the flexible power plants to the gas turbines still to manage the grid. So how does the panel see the future trends in terms of having more renewables in the grid and the role of the gas turbines?
You're talking about general.
General, yeah.
All right. That's all right. I don't mind. Kartikeya?
Something about it. So, I mean, I think the Indian context, or not even the Indian context, also the American context, I mean, we're just waiting for large-scale battery deployment to kind of shatter the need for gas as a bridge fuel for flexing even. There's a number of pilots on in India right now. I think, it's only a matter of time. The gas will be required for some flexing. There's even talk of using some of these existing thermal power plants for flexing. But some of the major geographies within India that are very renewable energy rich and would rather not see an import of fossil fuels from neighboring states or elsewhere, are going to start experimenting with large-scale solar and storage or solar wind hybrid and storage. And I think there have been some successful tenders recently in the U.S., particularly around Los Angeles County, that's trying to do kind of large-scale solar plus storage to be able to deal with the intermittency issues. The other area that I think is really needed for renewables integration is greater use of artificial intelligence for scheduling and forecasting. So the need to be able to understand and better program, system operators to be able to bring the electrons online as the weather changes, as that technology gets more perfected and the software is better developed, the ability to integrate renewables coupled with better and cheaper storage. I think I don't see gas as part of the mix in the long run, frankly. If batteries are there, if pumped hydro is there, and the software is there.
Okay, one or two more.
Could I just jump in on this very quickly?
Yeah, quickly.
Is it allowed?
Yes, sure.
6% of households, roughly, in India have air conditioning. That is going to explode. And air conditioning demand in India, because you don't have the big diurnal swings in temperature that you have in drier countries, is at night. So in our modeling, by 2050, we have about 400 gigawatt of nighttime load. I think the tenders that we have seen for batteries plus solar typically are 4 hours. 4-hour batteries supporting the peak, something else comes in for the rest of the night. I don't see people saying we have the battery technology today for 12 hours, right? And yet we will need 12 hours of 400 gigawatts most nights in India by 2050. So I think there's still a long way to go. And thermal flexing will definitely have to come in, but I personally see a role for some new build gas in India.
I'm going to jump in here because I actually think in a way they're both correct. And if you're looking at not the India context, but you're looking at the Southeast Asia context, and you want to talk about, the need for electricity, air conditioners, urbanization in countries like Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, the need for electricity is going to increase tremendously. And I think that there is a way down in the future where battery storage and renewables will be a significant portion of electricity generation. But we really do see a role for gas in the baseload because it's what's needed. And we're not there yet. I do think that technology is developing and it will happen, but it's to the point, I think Thomas's point is accurate in the sense that right now the batteries, they just don't give you enough. And so we really do see from an LNG perspective that gas is going to be coupled with renewables for the foreseeable future. That doesn't mean that it won't be phased out over a period of time, but for the next 20, 50 years, you're going to see LNG, you're going to see natural gas as part of the baseload for power generation.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap it up, but I want to put one plug in at the end. We haven't talked about energy efficiency. And the air conditioning factor, which is a global phenomena in terms of the loads that the air conditioning is being placed on systems. And I remember in Algeria after the Arabs, the spring, they gave everybody money, and what did they do? They bought cheap, inefficient air conditioners. And with the urbanization, as I said, just booming, and this issue of buildings, energy use, and load is going to really affect the power sector dramatically. And so I think that and I did a piece earlier last year on grid interconnected buildings. I think there's a lot of opportunity now with AI and advanced technologies to have more load shifting and other ways of trying to manage that load and to interface with automated systems in the new buildings that are going to be built. We used to have a saying that 70% of the buildings in India by 2030 haven't been built yet. And I think that is, having been to India in 1970 and seeing where it is now, it's about right. But anyway, let's thank the panel for a great discussion.